Hey guys, we're well, everyone filter in real quick and we're going to get going for you guys today. We've got a great member update for you. Wanted to first take the time to introduce myself as this is the first one I'm doing with you guys. My name's Ryan Castle. I started as the CEO of the Charleston Trident Association Realtors on April 21st, so about 7 weeks in right now. I've got out to a lot of brokerage offices, as I'll talk about in a second too. But I'm not new to CTAR. I worked here from 2008 to 2014 as the government affairs director. But for the past 11 years, I've been the CEO of the Cape Cod and Islands Association of Realtors and MLS in Massachusetts. And then also for the last 4 years of that, I worked kind of a hybrid capacity, living in Charleston, working up there on Cape Cod. So Charleston's my home, where I've made my home, where I grew up. So happy to be back and around, and wanted to get through some updates with you guys today, but also then bring in some guests we have later on as well. So a couple things we do have coming up to alert you to is we have our Cocktails for Community in support of the Realtors Housing Opportunity Fund. If you don't know what ROOF is, it's our nonprofit that we raise money for and give out grants to those housing organizations that have needs that help community members. That is next Wednesday, June 18th. You can register today. The link will be dropped as well, I believe. Also in the recap email, we'll have the links to everything as well. It's $5 donation a roof to attend. It's at Common House Ale Works next Wednesday from 4:30 to 6:30. Also, we have coming up June 23rd and June 24th. We have live at CTAR. We have the SRS designation, specialist seller representative specialist certification, and it get 8 hours of CE as well. Be dropping that link as well. You can also QR code that on the calendar on the web on the screen or find it on our website as well. And then also Broker 3A and 3B is coming up in September and October, and the exam in later in October as well. So take time to learn if you're interested and you're eligible to take the broker classes. Feel free to take a look at this on our website and how you do that, or call Kelly, our education director, and she can walk you through it all. With that, a couple local things I wanted to make you aware of too that we're tracking. Mount Pleasant has several things going on. They have a new tree ordinance that went into effect on May 1st. That's causing some issues in transactions as there's changes to tree protection areas. Pine trees were added as protected trees. You can see a full presentation of that QR code there as well. They're also talking about a moratorium in the settlement communities to match Charleston County's existing one on on subdivision of land in the settlement communities over there, as well as talking about changes to isolated non-jurisdictional wetlands issues. So we're tracking that as well. But really, to update you on the tree issues, we have set up a webinar on Monday, June 23rd at 10 a.m. via Zoom with the Mount Pleasant Planning Director, Michelle Reed, and the Chief Arborist, Chris Lubert, and they'll walk you through the new tree protection rules. This is really important for those that are coming in thinking about remodeling, buying houses and then remodeling, expanding footprints, putting in pools, putting in accessory structures, all that sort of thing, as there's really new, more stringent tree rules in Mount Pleasant. And they'll both Michelle and Chris will walk you through what those rules are and what you need to know for your clients. So please take the time to register for that. Also, I wanted to alert you too, because I'm getting a lot of questions about this recently. There are a new ordinance that caps short-term rentals at 60 permits per council district in the city of North Charleston. The council districts 5, 8, and 10 are above the cap, but the city of North Charleston has a great dashboard out that shows you what council districts have how many permits, how many are waiting behind those permits, and all that sort of stuff is a great resource for you to send clients if they're buying in that area and thinking about short-term rentals. They'll to be able to send to them to say, hey, here are the rules, here's this dashboard that you can track everything yourself. Also from the South Carolina Realtors, we'll have more out from us later this week on this as well. But the new forms are available, and there's video updates on their on South Carolina Realtors YouTube accounts. There's new compensation agreements that splits apart whether it's a listing broker to buyer broker compensation, which is cooperative compensation, or it's a seller to buyer broker compensation and is being paid directly from the seller to buyer broker. So there's new compensation agreements on both those. There's updated exclusive right to buy, buyer agency contracts. There's updated regular contract to buy and sell real estate, residential real estate. A new form, home warranty addendum, a bunch of new forms. Take the time to familiarize yourself with all of these. And feel free to call the legal hotline with any questions on that. Um, Last week, I spent and most of our leadership spent last week in Washington, D.C. At the National Association of Realtor legislative meetings. A couple changes came out of those meetings I wanted you to be aware of as NAR kind of does their governance twice a year in the Realtor legislative meetings in the mid section of the year, and then at the end of the year in November, their annual meeting. Um, Many of the changes that will come out will be their budgets or changes to the code of ethics or any policy type stuff like that. So a couple things to run over that they did last week is the NAR dues for 2026 will stay the same. Um, they did make changes to the consumer advertising campaign assessment. So that's rolled into your dues here when you get your CTAR membership fee bill and you see the NAR line. This assessment's already part of that. It's just they changed how they're allocating that assessment to basically in order to make the next settlement payment from the NAR settlement. So wanted to just highlight that. But they are keeping the dues the same. Later in the year, CTAR and SCR pass their budgets that will determine their dues. So those are the kind of the three layers of the three-way agreement of your membership. And so NAR is always the first to kind of set their due structure at their May meetings. There are some changes to the Code of Ethics, changes to Article 10, the Fair Housing article. The Standard Practice 10.5 had some changes. Here is where you can read it. The new 10.5 reads Realtors in their capacity as real estate professionals in association with their real estate business or in their real estate related activities shall not harass any person or persons based on race, color, religion, sex, disability, familiar status, national origin, sexual orientation, or gender identity. And then a whole paragraph added, as used in this code of ethics, harassment is unwelcome behavior directed at an individual or group based on one or more or the above protected characteristics, where the purpose of the effect of the behavior is to create a hostile, abusive, or intimidating environment which adversely affects their ability to access equal professional services or employment opportunity. Basically, what happened was with some legal challenges going on, they needed to clear up 10.5 as a standard of practice, and this is the way NAR has chosen to do it. Basically, because they already had a defined definition of harassment, so they wanted to make sure they had harassment in there. And so that's where this went. But it's basically just trying to create a standard application of 10.5 around the country for a local and state professional standards committees who have to deal with this enforcement of the code to have a clear understanding of what it meant. All other things is there was compensation related code changes, just clarifying some things in our settlement pursuant to the code of ethics. They wanted to make sure the code of ethics did not in any way impede ability of a realtor's ability to negotiate compensation. Just wanted to make that crystal clear and that had always been that way in the code of ethics. It also clarifies that you cannot withhold offers to negotiate compensation, but that should not impede your ability or impede your allowance to negotiate compensation, and then deleted standard practice 1616, which was frequently misunderstood to be that a realtor could not negotiate its compensation in local interpretations some places around the country. So they just wanted to clarify some of that stuff in the code, which they did in kind of a wholesale cleanup on that. All right, so that's what I have for my presentation. I'm going to bring in now some of the folks here to talk to you. So I want to first bring in Lindsay Jackson Hutto, who's the Chief Advocacy Officer of the South Carolina REALTORS, to talk to Lindsay a little about this year's legislative session in Columbia now that it's over. Lindsay, how to go this year? What are your highlights from this year in Columbia?
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me on today, Ryan. I'm Lindsay Hutto. I'm your Chief Advocacy Officer at SCR. So I'm your boots on the ground at the South Carolina State House. And I always love getting to speak together with my local and federal colleagues so that we can kind of bring our message full circle and really show how our organization works together to ensure that our realtor priorities and consumer priorities are addressed in all the facets of government. So what did the legislature do this year? And I want to give y'all kind of a quick overview of what we were dealing with and what we were looking at. So the legislature officially completed the first year of their 2-year session. Any legislation that did not pass can still advance into the 2026 session. But we've adjourned sine die. We've come back to deal with the budget. We've come back to deal with the very small amount of vetoes that the governor had this year, kind of given that no earmarks were in the budget, or as some call them, community projects were not included. So the governor really didn't have very much to veto this year. The legislature is not planning to come back over the summer, which is a change from the past couple of years. So we're coming off a very successful 2024 session. We passed our real estate license law modernization and the prohibition of those unfair service agreements. So that was a really big year for us. But 2025 coming into it presented some interesting challenges as the 2024 elections kind of resulted in some historic turnover at the State House. This year we had freshman legislators make up nearly 20% of the General Assembly. We had 13 new senators, which is unheard of. It's the highest number since, I believe, the 90s. And we had over 20 new House members. So if you've seen in the news that kind of a historically low number of bills were actually passed this year, this is largely due to there being a large learning curve with so many new folks trying to get everyone up to speed. And then on top of the new folks, we still kind of have that different factors like the party infighting that's still going on and kind of that drip down from national politics kind of influencing the agendas in our legislature. So we've had a lot going on. But even with all this chaos, SCR really took the time this year to make sure that we were building new relationships with the freshman members and kind of nurturing our existing relationships with our incumbents and our realtor champions. And I think it's important to really note that relationships really matter in politics. Building that trust and fostering that collaboration with our elected officials and other organizations is so crucial for us to have a strong voice at the State House. And we really like to take that long-term approach and really build these solid relationships so that when we do have another big ask like our license law bill, we have that political capital when we need it. So these alliances we spend time making seem to take a long time, but they really help us in the long term drive good policy forward and stop that bad policy before it impacts your business. So the General Assembly kind of honed their focus in on 4 big items this year. They looked at educational vouchers, they looked at liquor liability and tort reform, energy reform, and tax reform. So as you can imagine, these are some kind of heavy topics, definitely ones that required a lot of debate. So this took up a majority of the session. However, we did have a couple things come through this year. First and foremost, dealing with continuing education requirements for non-resident real estate brokers. This was signed into law and took immediate effect upon the governor's signature. So this legislation basically allows continuing education credits for non-residents to be applied towards South Carolina CE as long as the Real Estate Commission approves it. This still allows the Real Estate Commission to evaluate the out-of-state education criteria. Not just any will count. The Real Estate Commission has to approve it. And it provides that path forward for South Carolina to participate and reciprocal agreements with our neighboring states. So as of today, the REC has signed the agreement with Georgia. We are still in negotiations with North Carolina. So if anybody happens to be also licensed in North Carolina, you are still going to need your South Carolina CEs because it will not count right now until that reciprocal agreement is signed. Another item I wanted to mention this year is insurance. Insurance was a huge topic at the State House. Our House of Representatives was very proactive. They put together an insurance rate review ad hoc study committee. And I know you're thinking study committee. There's a million of those all the time. But the chair, excuse me, Speaker Merle Smith and Chair Bill Hurt Persman sent a large group down to Florida to kind of look at, what's all going on down there and making sure that what's happening in Florida is not happening in South Carolina. So the speaker tapped one of Charleston's own, Gary Brewer, to chair this committee and look at these rising insurance premiums and coverage that's available in the state. So this committee is going to continue to meet over the interim to really examine South Carolina's insurance rates from property and casualty, for residential and commercial properties to automobiles and kind of everything in between. The goal is to get these insurance companies and insurers actually in the room to hear from them, to hear why the rates are what they are, to hear where these rate numbers are coming from, and to figure out how we address coverage availability in the state. So this ad hoc committee has already met twice and plans to meet throughout the session in hopes of addressing this issue in 2026. So it's not always kind of what's up for debate in the House and what's actually being passed. There's a lot going on behind the scenes. And I just wanted to quickly mention that a lot of our session was spent working with various leaders and chairmen in efforts to bring forward issues that impact your industry, like HOA issues and short-term rental standardization. We're making sure that we kind of have these issues set up to a place of success, kind of get some of the road bumps out of the way, and make sure that when we do actually have bills that are filed, that stakeholders are working together and not against each other. So right now we have a skeleton bill of an HOA bill that's going to look at addressing fee transparency. And I've heard a lot from, I'm sure, some of you on this call and definitely some CTAR members looking at language to make sure that HOAs regularly publish and update their fees and have them available at a reasonable cost. This is something we've been working on for a while. The HOAs definitely have a strong lobby, but we have been sitting down with those groups and sitting down with other interested parties to try to come together on an agreement to bring some more transparency and accountability into this space. And then short-term rentals, I actually have to pop out at 11 for a meeting today. We are talking with the Municipal Association to try to come to a compromise on some short-term rental standardization language. I'm basically saying there's not going to be an outright ban, but massaging some language that would allow the municipalities that are doing it right to continue to do that and not be penalized, but kind of setting forth some guidelines and best practices that are going to ensure that quality of life, but also balance individual property rights. So with all that, stay tuned as those kind of get ironed out and we prepare for the 2026 session. And I want to thank you all for your time today. And as always, please feel free to reach out to me if you need anything or have any questions. Thank you, Ryan.
So, Lindsay, do you think like some of those issues that you talked about, the insurance study committee on the rate stuff, the HOA and short-term rentals could come back up in 2026? Do you think they're going to be topic of conversations in 2026, or is that further down the line several years?
Right now, I know insurance is kind of on the front of everyone's minds, and I think the House especially plans to at least have something filed. As far as something getting passed in 1 year of a session, that's always looking to the crystal ball to see if that will actually come to fruition. But I do think we've got a good group of House members that are really laser focused on this. They really want to get some answers, and they really want to have at least a concept of an idea put together. As far as the HOAs and short-term rentals, we are very close. We are so close to, this is the closest we've been to an agreement with the Municipal Association in years. So I feel confident that we're at least going to have some sort of compromise at least worked out. Even if it's a situation where it being election year next year too, things get a little crazy. We still got, I think we'll have most of the stakeholders on board. So hopefully the lift will be not as heavy if we get that worked out beforehand.
All right, great. And if everyone feel free to use the Q&A if you have any questions for Lindsay on any of the state issues there as well. But I want to thank you, Lindsay, for the time you taken today. And people can always reach out to you with further questions, right? What's your email
Absolutely.
address they can hit you at?
Yep, I will put it in the chat.
I don't think we have one up, but
Okay. Um,
yeah, this
it's
one, but yeah.
ljhutto at screaltors.org.
All right. Thank you very much, Lindsay, for that. I don't see any questions coming on, so I'm going to bring in now and let you get to your meeting. But
Ryan, we had one
Joe,
question. We have one question in the chat. It goes back to the standards of practice. And it says, who is the arbiter of what constitutes speech that is harassment? NAR CTR professional standards.
yeah, so that would be the panel that hears you, the professional standards panel, and that is South Carolina Realtors does the enforcement for Code of Ethics in South Carolina, and so it'd be the panel that hears the facts of the case in a hearing of professional standards. But they further defined harassment as it was already defined in the Code of Ethics to kind of outline 10.5 there. So I want to also now bring in Joe Harris. He is the NAR VP of government government advocacy, I believe, at NAR, and he is a man in the know with everything going on at the federal level right now, which is a lot. But I want to highlight the South Carolina at NAR because Joe's got deep South Carolina connections and so he understands our state and our needs of having already worked for people in Congress from South Carolina. So, Joe, pleasure to have you here. A lot of people
Yeah.
probably know you already because you've probably been to a lot of events and things like that around the state. So, just thank you for taking the time to talk to us today because I know well, you're probably talking about as good as maybe 9 o'clock this morning, but who knows what's happened since 9 o'clock this morning on your level. So, can you just kind of set Congress in 2025, what y'all were thinking about at NAR and your strategy coming out, and obviously for the big issue of tax reform this year?
Yeah. Thanks, Ryan. Great to be with you and your members. You're absolutely right. I'm no stranger to South Carolina. I worked for many years for Congressman John Spratt, who was a member from the 5th Congressional District, Rock Hill, York, Sumter, Darlington, um, for 30 years in Congress. So originally from Columbia, South Carolina. So and a Gamecocks fan. Sorry, Tigers, but great to be with you. And thanks to so many of you who were just here last week. We had a really successful realtor legislative meeting. I think the Hill meetings went very well. I'm hearing a lot of positive feedback from both the programming and the time that we allotted to go to the Hill on Wednesday. We really try hard to work with the speaker's office to make sure that we have these things when the Congress is actually in session, which is a big help. So we're very fortunate that the calendar worked with us this year, but a lot of work to do. A lot of work to do. Obviously, so Ryan, you alluded to it. Tax reform is really dominated the first 6 months of this Congress, and that's going to continue to be the case as the Senate now takes up the process. But the key is we kind of knew since last November's elections, when Republicans gained control of all three legislative branches, we knew that reconciliation was likely going to be the main event, right? So November 2024, that's when we started putting together a strategy. Because before the elections, what if Democrats win the White House, or win the House, or Republican White House, Democratic House. So we're going through all these permutations, trying to figure out who the chairs and the ranking members were going to be. But we really started putting together this two-pronged strategy. And the first prong of our advocacy efforts really honed in on something that Lindsay said earlier, and that's, relationships absolutely do matter. We've got a new Congress, and in November, we knew who the new members were going to be, even though they weren't going to get sworn in until January of 2025. So they were already coming to DC, and they were already having meetings and trying to meet with the Republican conference, the Democratic conference. A lot of the members who were our friends were retiring, right? Or they had lost re-election, or they were running for governor or something like that. So really it was a chance to sort of have general conversations with particularly the new members and the members that were going to be returning, and the members that we knew were likely going to find their way onto Ways and Means or Senate Finance, which are the two main tax writing committees. But the first prong of that approach was information gathering, kind of feeling folks out, seeing what they were thinking, general conversations with both sides, right, about our legislative priorities, and pushing hard for extension of those expiring provisions in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. We knew they were going to be expiring at the end of this year. So we really wanted to put down a marker early on things like 199A, opportunity zones, SALT, keeping that, the lower capital gains rates. So all of those great wins that were good for real estate that we had in the 2017 law. And so we did a really good job of making sure that we first keep what we have, that we know it's working, we know it's good for the industry. And then the second approach was pushing for new legislation that specifically addressed housing supply issues. Obviously, we don't have enough existing homes for sale. There are not as many new homes being built. We wanted to really push for legislation that, more homes on the market, things like that we knew would increase the inventory. So when the one big beautiful bill passed the House a couple weeks ago, we made out pretty well on the first prong of that strategy, right? We secured a boost in the 199A qualified business income deduction, went from 20% to 23% in the House bill. A significant increase in the SALT deduction limit from $10,000 to $40,000. Still, there's still the issue of the marriage penalty, right? So that amount remains the same for both single and joint filers, but that number went up, which was a big priority of not only President Trump when he was running for re-election. He wanted a higher SALT cap, but also a lot of SALT Republicans, so-called SALT Republicans in the House. We got an expansion of low-income housing tax credit. We got a renewal and enhancement of the Opportunity Zones program, which is obviously something that's near and dear to Senator Tim Scott's heart, and has worked very hard on that. But I think what we didn't anticipate, probably should have, but obviously playing defense on the legislation that they had to extend, but all the other items in the bill that were going to cost a lot of money. Obviously we knew that extending the 2017 CCJA was going to be expensive, but we didn't factor in no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, no tax on Social Security. And these things cost a lot of money. And so that takes away, when you add these things in, you don't have as much money to spend on so-called housing inventory type programs and legislation. So that's where really this year's RLM talking points and legislative asks came in. We reiterated our asks for a number of the bills that you all are very familiar with at this point. More homes on the market, that doubles that sales gain tax on the sale of a primary residence. Very important. That number has been at 250,000 and 500,000 since 1997, right? It's 30 years. Revitalizing Downtowns and Main Streets Act. That bill is very important for converting underutilized commercial space into mixed use residential. There's a housing supply framework, basically the YIMBY Act from last Congress, that puts HUD in charge of setting a framework and putting it together a task force of folks who essentially write best practices for state and local governments to use and put some teeth and some money behind that to sort of be a blueprint, right, for folks to use. So a lot of people ask, how do we go about supporting this bill? Well, we sent in a letter of support for the housing provisions that were in the reconciliation bill, the House bill, right? And I got a lot of questions about this during RLM. Did NAR support the Republican only partisan tax bill? Well, we did the same thing that we've done in years past with the Biden Inflation Reduction Act, the CARES Act under Biden, the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act under Trump. We were very specific about supporting housing provisions that are in the bill, but stopping short of blanketly supporting the entire legislation. So that's what we did with this reconciliation bill. And all of the bills that I just mentioned were done through reconciliation. And by definition, they're partisan exercises. When one party controls both the House and the Senate and the White House, you can guarantee that reconciliation is going to get done. So that's what we did with this version of the reconciliation bill. I should also note that with regard to a lot of the other things that we're tracking, tax provisions, we're already hearing talk from top Republicans on the Ways and Means Committee that they want to reach a deal with Democrats later in the year on tax changes that both parties can agree on. So you would think that addressing, this historic housing shortage would qualify, right, as something that would be bipartisan. So the other thing I said a lot during RLM is just because a lot of the more homes on the market and those bills that make it into this tranche, this version, and are unlikely to be a part of the next version that the Senate is taking up, there's going to be another bite at the apple with regard to the second prong priorities that we set forth. But, we got a long way to go. They got to get this bill done first. And so the Senate's up and they're in the midst of taking up the House reconciliation bill. We're already hearing there's some sticking points. And if you watch anything, right, the news, CNBC, you already know that the cost is probably one of the biggest things that a lot of Senate Republicans are pushing back on. The CBO has estimated that this bill is going to cost $3 trillion, going to add $3 trillion to the deficit. And obviously, Elon Musk has been very vocal, right? A lot of Senate Republicans have been very vocal about not wanting to add that much to the deficit, which means something's got to give, right? So I'm not sure what the recent entrance of Elon Musk into the fray is going to mean for the outcome in the Senate. My money, I fully expect the Senate is going to get that bill done, sent back to the House. But the other issue that's kind of a sticking point is that $40,000 SALT cap. There's not a natural constituency for SALT amongst the Senate Republican conference. That's really something that has been focused on by some maybe 6 or 7 House Republicans. So I expect that number to go down a little bit because they're going to try to save some money, maybe down to 30,000 or maybe 20,000. But the question is, if this bill is materially changed in such a way that it loses support from the House Republicans that supported it the first time, what does that mean? And SALT Republicans are already on record saying, if it's not a $40,000 cap, we're not voting for it. So there's a lot of things at play, but our Hill visits in the Senate last week came at a very, very good time, and we'll see how that process unfolds. One of our asks was also adding people to the bipartisan real estate caucus. We added over 20 new members as of last Friday. I haven't checked what the numbers are as of today, but that's pretty good. I think we're up to 91 members, which is very impressive. But we really do want to engage that, the real estate caucus. And after all the fever and the oxygen of the tax reform is kind of gone and dissipated, we're definitely going to re-engage and get other real estate groups. As many of you know, NAR hosted the kickoff event earlier in the year with the Real Estate Caucus. We had a great attendance, 200 congressional staff, some members of Congress showed up, maybe 30 or 40 members of Congress showing support for real estate issues. So we really want to develop that programming, engage the caucus. So that's definitely one of the priorities for the rest of the Congress. Furthermore, we're staying engaged on other top, non-tax reform issues. Another question I get when I go and speak and hear concerns is cuts at HUD. We've definitely been active in communicating with this administration about some of the programs at HUD that we believe are imperative, that are working. And, Congress does have the power of the purse. Even though the president releases budget, it's up to the House and the Senate to decide, how those federal dollars are spent. In fact, at 3:00 today, I'm attending a bipartisan meeting with the Housing and Insurance Subcommittee Chairman Mike Flood and Ranking Member Emmanuel Cleaver. They actually both support the Home Investment Partnership Program and the CDBG programs, and they wanted to hear from groups like ours about how these programs are working so that they can better make the case to their colleagues. And NAR has been asked to participate in that. We obviously submitted a letter of support, and we solicited actual real life examples of how these programs are working back in the States. So we'll be participating in that roundtable later today. Building on federal land, earlier this year, HUD and Interior announced a joint task force on exploring this possibility. Obviously, the devil's in the details, but any effort to increase housing supply, we're going to support. We know that the Interior Department oversees more than 500 million acres of federal land. It's very expensive to maintain that land. And so we want to look for opportunities where it makes sense to use some of that land to build more housing. GSE reform, obviously that's been in the news a lot, bringing Fannie and Freddie out of conservatorship. The president has tweeted about it. We've been very, very clear in the government guarantee that's extremely important for these programs, but we're monitoring that. We expect that to heat up, and we have a seat at the table. And Lindsay also addressed this earlier, the rising cost of insurance. That's something that we're hearing more and more around the country. It's becoming more expensive and harder to procure for millions of Americans. And that obviously adds to the affordability crisis. So that is something that, even though, there's a insurance trade that does a very good job here in DC, insurance, obviously inherently a state issue. But when it rises to the level of where I think it's going and only going to get worse, it becomes a national crisis, a national issue, and it's going to require some type of leadership at the federal level to make sure all the different parts are talking to each other. So that's kind of, I know that's a lot, but that's a little look at tax reform, kind of where we've been, where we are now, and where we hope to go. And
Joe, thanks. I wanted to share this real quick so we can talk a little bit about the 5 things I guess y'all were looking at really in the tax reform. I think, one, it retains and increases, the House version retains and increases the business qualified income deduction from 20% to 23%. Quadruples the state and local tax deduction to $40,000 for households making under $500,000. In the House version, as you said, that might be the sticking point in the Senate, one of the sticking points of the Senate. Makes the current lower rates for individuals permanent, preserves and makes permanent the current mortgage interest deduction, which was a huge issue because with the higher standard, you thought that might be on the chopping block because less people are taking the mortgage interest right now. And then last is 1031 like-kind exchanges are protected. And I wanted to ask you, because one of the questions that came in was on 1031 like-kind. How significant is the discussion around getting rid of that or calling that back at times? Because y'all are always protecting it, but I think a lot of members don't realize that it actually is on the chopping block. Or how do you view that?
Yeah, so it was. A lot of things were on the chopping block earlier this year, including MID. There was talk about lowering MID from 750 to 500,000. So all of these things were on the table, and what happens during that sort of information gathering uh, sort of process that we go through at the beginning of the Congress, end of last Congress, is really to get a feel for what people think about some of these proposals, including 1031 like kind exchange, carried interest, which few of our members really care about, but some of our members do. But what ends up happening is they float these ideas to groups like ours to see what the reaction is going to be, to see what the temperature is. And so that's why it's really important to have conversations. Even though the Democrats weren't really part of the reconciliation process, they are involved with the process because they're friends with Republican staffers. They hear things. It was actually Chairman Richie Neal, or Ranking Member Richie Neal, Democrat from Massachusetts, who's ranking on House Ways and Means, who pulled me aside and said, "Hey, I think MID is actually on the table, so you might want to get your troops, going there." So 1031 is for whatever reason, to a lot of people seen as something that the juice may not be worth the squeeze. So it's our job to point out who exactly is taking advantage of this tax deferment tool. And we point it to the number of multifamily buildings that were being constructed. They almost exclusively use the 1031, right? And so these are small businesses, mom and pop. And so it was very important to distinguish the mom and pop small businesses from the larger corporate types, right? Because that's sort of the populist wing of both parties really want to stick it to the wealthy, which is fine. But inadvertently, what's defined as wealthy? And then you go down that road. So we never get a lot of credit for the things that don't make it into the bill that were left out. But the pay fors is where we're always, sort of looking and making sure we're having conversations. And again, making relationships with new members, but it's not just the members, it's the staff. We have a lot of staff turnover. And so you're constantly educating these young staffers about what exactly these programs do. That's why I'm going to be on the Hill later today talking about CDBG at home programs under HUD, because a lot of these kids that come in don't know what they do. And they look at a number, they're trying to cut. Obviously, deficit reduction is a very important part of what they're trying to do here in Congress. So they're looking for things to cut, but you're right. 1031 was definitely on the table. SALT was a big. They were trying to figure out how high to dial the SALT number for it
And
to
on
make
salt, I
sense.
think it's pretty misconstrued, right, around the country. Because, you look at even in South Carolina, right? And
Mhm.
you're talking about, at this point, a $750,000 house in Mount Pleasant or $1 million house in Mount Pleasant
Yeah,
is going to hit, but that and 5% state income tax, you're going to hit $10,000 pretty quickly on
yeah,
that tax deduction. You could even hit 30, and especially if a second home in South Carolina too, you have things like that. The while they claim it's blue states, like I think maybe someone said it. I think we were meeting with Representative Nancy Mace's office this week and last week, and he said, the way I phrase salt is it affects everybody. It affects some more than others, but everyone benefits from raising that cap over 10,000 pretty much in every congressional district.
yeah, and that's right. The problem that we always run into with a tax bill is that these limits are set. Now, in the case of SALT, there was, before 2017, there was no limit on state and local taxes, and that's a tax provision that was part of the original tax code going back to the days of George Washington, Alexander Hamilton. It hadn't been touched really until 2017. And so when you set a arbitrary number, they came up for $10,000. It wasn't indexed, and it didn't. Unlike most parts of the tax code, there's a difference between a single filer and a joint filer. And so in this case, it's a perfect example, just like the gain on sale of primary residence, right? That cap had been set in 1997, when the average cost of a house, I think, was around $115,000. Now it's triple that. So that has a direct impact on people's behavior. And if you are somebody who bought a house in the 90s, right? You bought it for $100,000, $125,000, $200,000, whatever it is, and that house is tripled in value. The house is now 1.5, 1 point. If you want to downsize, are you going to do that, knowing that you're going to pay all those capital gains to the U.S. government? I don't know a CPA in the country that would advise that. Any CPA I know would say, you're better off gifting that to your kids. They can take the step up in basis and off they go. And that's a better way actually to provide wealth to your family. But we have to start incentivizing folks to create inventory, right? They're not going to do it out of the kindness of their heart. There's got to be incentives for doing that. And in an effort to pay for a bill that happens to be moving at that time in 1997, I think that's when they last did, set a lot of these rates. When Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich got together and tried to do something bipartisan, it wasn't indexed, but it's not indexed because you have to pay for that. You have to pay for that over the life of the legislation. So it's a lot easier to just set a limit and ignore the fact that that inflation is going to happen, which is cost of living. It doesn't account for that. But, it's hard to do all those things because it costs money. But at the end of the day, if the economic activity on the back end makes up for what you're spending on the front end, then that's an investment, right? Particularly if that investment is, significantly more than what you paid on the front end. And so the argument that we've made, and it's been quite effective on the Hill, is that unlike a lot of industries that come in here and want to be excluded from the tax code or want, limits or, want exemptions, real estate actually adds to the economy. We're adding jobs. We're creating wealth through home ownership. So you can't look at it, who knows whether, no tax on tips is going to do the same thing. Hard to say. But real estate, we know for a fact what the cumulative impact of that is, over the course of many, many years. So again, we just have to keep educating people, understand we've got new Congress, a lot of new faces, a lot of people who don't know what a 1031 is. They just know, they look at the cost. But what they don't look at is all the economic activity that comes from those exchanges. Your Uncle Sam's going to get his pound of flesh one way or the other, right? But between the time that initial exchange is made, and maybe there are 2 exchanges, 3 exchanges, look at all the economic activity. Look at all of the new apartment buildings and condo buildings, conversions that are done, creating multifamily and multi-use real estate. Look at all the economic activity that's resulted in that time. And so when you're looking at what you're trying to get from a 1031 versus the economic activity that results from them, it's not even close. And also, by the way, if they were to somehow curtail the 1031 like-kind exchange, use that as an example, if you think that folks would use a 1031 in the same way after they curtail that tax deferral tool, then you're kidding yourself. People just wouldn't use them. They're not going to just willy-nilly throw money to the federal government if they can. People are, CPAs and tax advisors are very, very quick to advise their clients on what makes the most sense. So they will sit on those properties. There will be less of the economic activity that happens that results from curtailing 1031. And again, we stress it is not tax avoidance. It is tax deferment. There's a big difference. Uncle Sam's going to get his at the end of the day. So we just, it's all about bringing those examples to life for a lot of these staffers who take what the president and the leaders of, are saying they want in a bill, and they have to craft a bill. They have to write a bill that has real world consequences. And we want to make sure that there aren't unintended consequences of what they're trying to do. Absolutely. We're all on board for lowering the deficit. I think everybody is. That is something that is a bipartisan, bicameral concern. But you want to make sure that you're not inadvertently pushing out those policies that are creating economic activity, that are growing the gross domestic product. So that's where we spend a lot of our time. Evan and his team do a great job on the federal tax side. Obviously, Lawrence on the research, his team, we have a very robust suite of resources on the research side that helps kind of make that case. And it also helps that we're not the only real estate group talking about this stuff. We're part of a consortium of real estate groups in DC, home builders, the multifamily housing, the REITs, the shopping centers. We're all sort of part of this Nero family that tries to stay in lockstep with regard to our messaging around big bills like the reconciliation bill.
All right, thanks, Joe. A lot. Appreciate it.
We've got a
and-
couple of questions in the chat, just two.
Yeah.
One kind of dovetails off of what you were just talking about, Joe.
Okay, yeah.
Somebody asked if we partner with the FEA to advocate for the 1031.
Yes. So there is a 1031. I don't know what they call it. It's made up of over 100 organizations, and we are part of that. So we're part of a couple different 1031 groups. They're the bigger ones that encompass not just real estate, but any manner of different organizations that effectively use 1031s. But we tend to really stick to real estate, and so there's a smaller group of real estate folks that we work with that are kind of, it's just easier to go in and talk about what we know best and have information, statistics, research on. But we're part of any number. I'd have to ask Evan how many different groups, support groups that we're part of for 1031. But that's going to be a really important fight. We're hearing in the early going that is not going to be on the chopping block in the Senate bill. Again, they're going to try to whittle away because the 1031 doesn't really bring the revenue, right? They understand that the behavior of the taxpayer is going to change if you make major changes to the policy.
And they just
whatever revenue you're projecting,
and so they won't have any taxable gains anyway.
That's right, because no one's going to use them.
Yeah.
So you have to factor that into the assumptions, and when we present them with that evidence, you're better off going after something else. And so that's a big part of what we talk about.
And these paid fors, Joe, real quick, they're kind of because there's some senators who want to roll back some of the cuts they're making to some of the programs.
Yeah.
Right. And so to do that, they're going to have to pay for it with something else. Right.
They're looking at the big ticket items. They're looking at obviously like SALT, something like a SALT, something like Social Security, Medicare. Like that's why there's this fight right now within the Republican conference about how many cuts to make to Medicaid, Medicare.
Yeah, because if you make cuts, then you don't have to pay for. But if you're going to add people back in, then you're going to have to pay for it somewhere else.
That's right. Yeah. And so it's right now trying to figure out what that number is that creates, because both sides of the ledger, what you're spending is an important tool, but also the dynamic scoring that they use. What what is the expected economic activity that's coming from these policies on the back end help to pay for a lot of these policies. And right now, the CBO is saying that the House bill will add $3 trillion to the deficit based on all that economic activity, based on, the no tax on tips, no tax on Social Security, and that stuff that's added in. Not sure what economic benefit. It's just hard to predict what kind of economic benefit for the people that are not paying tax on their tips. Are they spending more of that, on vacations, or are they putting that in the bank? It's just hard to know because it's a new policy. We don't have anything to go on. It's just something that just costs a lot of money. We don't know whether that's going to result in a net benefit.
In my ideal world, it revolves in more people reporting their tips, so their incomes are higher, so they can buy housing.
Let's hope.
Let's hope, right? Like that ideal world.
Yeah. And then it brings to light how many people were reporting tips in the first place. Cash tips. How do you, it's kind of the honor system a little bit. So there's a lot of unknowns about that, but it's something that is very costly, very expensive, but it's something that the president ran on. So it's part of the bill. But we expect that they won't touch that. They're going to look for things like I said, the SALT cap, and trying to nibble a little bit on the entitlement side. And maybe even some of the like the non-defense discretionary is kind of, there's, and you see like cuts to HUD, cuts to some of these programs, but, you also see a lot of efforts. I see that the senator from Alabama pushing back on efforts to take some of the federal money and say, hey, the states should pay for some of these programs in order to cut federal spending. But then the states are pushing back and saying, hey, we can't afford that either. So there's that little bit of give and take. And a lot of those more granular conversations are going to be had in the Senate, because unlike the House, where you have 435 members who represent a district, in the Senate, they represent an entire state. And so things like state budgets come into play. They really care about, the governors and the senators are kind of in constant conversation about what's going to break the bank with regard to the state budgets, and how much give and take there is with the federal policy that they're handing down. So there's going to be a lot of tougher questions coming in the Senate.
Megan, was there any other questions in that chat real quick?
Yeah, we have one more, and I do want to sneak this one in because I think that this is probably a question that everyone has, and very relevant to Charleston. Do you believe that there is any real hope of making the NFIP permanent? Is that even being discussed?
Not the short answer is not in the short term. Again, it has to do with the cost, and again, it has to do with the frequency of flooding, right? It's not about hurricanes anymore. It's about just 2 days of rain. You've seen flooding in places where you never thought you'd see flooding. Asheville, North Carolina. If it floods in the mountains, we're all in big trouble, right? So it's not just a coastal issue anymore, although states like California, Louisiana, South Carolina, Florida get all the attention, especially what's going on in Miami. But the chair, French Hill, and the ranking member on financial services, Maxine Waters, are committed to doing something bipartisan. I think the biggest issue is going to be around the costs and the same issues plaguing the overall insurance industry with regard to their coverage, pulling out of entire areas, right? Regions of the countries, pulling out of entire states, not even offering insurance, flood insurance in Miami. A lot of those issues plaguing the private market are plaguing the National Flood Insurance Program as well, because there's a finite amount of resources there. But, what we're trying to tell folks on both Senate banking, and we've had many conversations with Chairman Tim Scott, his staff, about this, is it's not only about the insurance portion of that. NFIP is not really an insurance program, right? It doesn't, the rates are not based on actuarial tables to the degree that they are in the private insurance market. But it's as much about the policies, as much about the policies of kind of restricting where people are building, making smarter choices about where people are building, resiliency. If there's a place that's flooded a bunch of times, maybe that should be a park, right, and not a shopping center, because at least with some benches and some picnic tables, if that floods, not an issue. When the water recedes, it's a park again, right? You're not paying millions of dollars of taxpayer money to keep fixing places that are repetitive lost properties. The conversations are happening because there's been some talk about getting rid of the National Flood Insurance Program, but again, it's kind of like privatizing GSEs. How does that look? What does that mean for the individual states that are then going to have to really pick up the majority of those liabilities? And are we better off? Again, it costs money, but are we better off providing the technology for LiDAR, for better mapping, to help local governments, state governments make smarter decisions about where they're building? I think that's what we're trying to get their focus. It's not just about, yes, the program is not solvent. It's in the red. And as long as these activities, and we all see it, it's happening more frequently, but as long as they continue to happen, back when the National Flood Insurance Program became a thing, we just didn't see the frequency of these natural disasters. They're happening. These aren't 100-year floods anymore, right? They're happening every year. So you have to then look at technology. And I hate to say AI, because it seems like we say AI for everything, but I think it's very applicable in a situation like this, when you're talking about really trying to predict the flow of water, topography, and making and modeling. Let's use the technology to our advantage. That costs money, but again, I think that's money that's well spent. That'll save us money in the long run. It's not just another line item that costs a lot of money. Sometimes you have to spend money to make money. And I think the flood insurance program is a perfect example of setting a framework that the states and local municipalities can then run with and use, and then offer carrots when you're doing the right thing, when you're making the tough decisions about where to build and where not to build. Offer those carrots to folks that are doing it the right way. And but yes, it's a very long-winded way of answering your question. The conversations are happening, but I think it's going to be awfully tough because, again, we're in deficit reduction mode, and but that doesn't mean that we're not going to keep coming up with these ideas, discussing them with the appropriate folks, because you never know when something's going to move. You never know when an idea and a proposal just gets taken off the shelf and put into whatever bill that's moving. So we want to make sure that folks are educated, aware of where our policy positions are on things like GSE reform, things like NFIP, housing inventory legislation, so that when the next thing does move, we're not, caught flat-footed. They already have our information. They have the research. They can just plug and play.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you for that. And everyone for staying on this long. I appreciate this first one we did for these. We're going to try to do these every other month. So look out for the next one, bringing different topics every time. Appreciate it. For those that haven't had me yet, I've got out to about half a dozen offices, office visits. Got more scheduled. Feel free to reach out to me and get one scheduled. I've got a presentation about the kind of where we see the industry right now. As I'm 7 weeks into this, trying to get going, but I appreciate guys like Joe that come in and provide updates and show the good work we're doing at NAR and on Capitol Hill. on behalf of our members. So thank you, Joe, and thank you, Lindsay, for being
Absolutely.
on today. She had to jump out to a meeting on short-term rental, so that's obviously President to us down here in Charleston area. So thank you guys for being on, and look forward to you next time.
All right. Thank you.